Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to a reading wrap up. I'm going to be talking about the books that I've read from June to the early days of August. So way back in June, I was listening to some adult fantasy on audiobook by Joe Abercrombie, and they are Before They Are Hanged and The Last Argument of Kings, and I'm going to talk about these two together because I read them back to back and they're kind of hard to separate in my head. I ended up giving both of these about a 4.5 stars for the second book and then a 4-ish stars. I want to say 4 stars for the third book. I did like the second book more than the third one, and that's because the way the plot ended in the first book, the way that it set up the second book, I really liked the dynamic between the characters and the way that the plot was driven a little bit by the characters. In a particular situation, it kind of sectioned them off so they interacted with each other, and that really gave the characters the chance to blossom, and the dynamics between them really became stretched and quite interesting and very raw and humorous in parts as well. And even though I don't usually go for political fantasy, which is kind of what this leaned into towards the third book, I really like Joe Abercrombie's writing because he could really convince me of character, and all of the things that the characters did in this book and the way these characters grew are what really compelled me to continue. That said though, there was one particular character that I didn't really care about, and that is West, and then also his sister Artie. I didn't really care about either of them. They kind of seemed to be there and be parts of other characters' plots and not really their own plots, but that's probably my unique take on them rather than what they were actually there for. So I don't know if that's a popular or unpopular opinion or not. These books are also really morally grey, and that lends into a lot of the violence that plays out in this series. I want to include the first book when I talk about the fact that there is a lot of violence across this series, and the violence is not shied away from at all. It all happens on the page. But that said, there's not particular rape in this story, which is a reason that I like this series. It doesn't pivot on that as a particular plot point for a character. That said though, there is threats of sexual violence and rape in the book, but it doesn't get delved into. It's kind of glossed over and mentioned, so it is prevalent and it is discussed, but it's not something that's pivotal to a particular character growing. I particularly like that the female character Faru that we get to follow through this series is not a heroic kind of character. She hisses at people, she's very angry all the time. I tend to like female characters who are a little bit more gritty, like Mia Corvair from Nevernight. I really liked her, and this was a bit of a darker, more rabid version of Mia, and that's why I really liked her. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite give these a 5 out of 5 stars. I wanted to because the writing, the plot, and the pace were really great, and none of that took me out of the story whatsoever. But when it came to the endings, I'm used to a more cataclysmic finish, but it didn't really leave that with me. It was not a satisfying finish, so to speak, but it was just a very, here are all the cards on the table and this is how it has all tied up kind of finish. I know this world is explored more in standalones after this trilogy, so I'm definitely going to continue reading that. I believe Best Served Cold is the next book, but I haven't read the blurb because I've only just recently finished the trilogy and I didn't want to spoil myself by accident. So given where the characters left off, I'm really interested to see what happens next because they're all very different characters and in very different places to what they were at the beginning of the series. These characters have really developed from book 1 to book 3, and the fact that I still am on board with all of them, except for West and Artie, like I mentioned, means I will definitely continue reading their stories. And I know this is a fairly glossed over kind of recap of what happens, but without delving into spoilers, which is easy to do if I start mentioning names, I just want to say that I really enjoyed this series, and Joe Abercrombie's writing is definitely up there with some of my favourites. Even though his books weren't quite 5 stars, his writing definitely has potential for me, and one of the characters actually did remind me a little bit of Dalinar from the Stormlight Archive. Not in the sense that he's a particularly honourable character, but just in the sense that he's got a dark past and he wants to grow from that. And with Dalinar, we see the morally good come forward and the heroic side of him come forward, whereas in this series we see Logan really try and fight the darkness, but the darkness kind of not overcome him, but he has to grapple with it a lot more than Dalinar, because morally ambiguous and morally grey characters and darkness is explored a lot more in this series compared to the heroic kind of characters in the Stormlight Archive. The next book I read is actually a physical book, and it is Aurora Rising by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. This is their new young adult sci-fi. It's a multiple perspective book. It follows about 6 or 7 different characters. All of the characters in this go to Aurora Academy, and they end up getting thrown together as a squad when Ty accidentally misses his last exam to become a pilot. So he ends up pulling the short straw when it comes to picking his squad mates because he missed the exam and doesn't get to choose first dibs, and this is what he's been training for his entire life. So he kind of misses out on that as he discovers our character Aurora, who is on the front. And I don't really want to say how he does that or what happens in that discovery, but that happens in the first couple of chapters, and then after after that is the fallout of this team getting thrown together and what happens with Aurora. And I really like the tension that ends up getting built in this, but at the beginning it took me a little bit to get into just because the humour was fairly heavy, and so I couldn't get used to the characters in dire situations when they were making sarcastic, flippant jokes. But that did level out a bit towards the middle and end. The jokes were still there, but I actually found them a little bit more gratifying because I knew who the characters were. And I really like about this ending, not that I'm going to spoil it, I like that Amy and Jay went down the harder route rather than the easier route. And if you've read it, you'll definitely understand what I mean, but they went for the more heart-wrenching way to end a story rather than the easier way of getting out of a situation. And I really respect that, and that's why I'm definitely going to continue. I would continue anyway because it's Amy and Jay, but I'm going to continue this as kind of a priority when Aurora 2 comes out, because the way this ended made me really keen to read the next book. At the beginning of the book, I was giving it about a 3.5 stars just because the characters weren't really sitting with me, but by the middle to end, like I said, I got a little bit more used to them, and it was a pretty fun book, even though I did say that it was emotional more towards the end. I am invested in the characters in this, and I did give it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I ended up reading Queenslayer by Sebastian de Castell, and this is one of my favourite authors, one of my new favourite authors, and this is the 5th book in his Spellslinger series, so the 6th book comes out at the end of this year. I had really high hopes for this book. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars, but it was kind of a lesser 5 out of 5 stars compared to his previous work. I think his previous work is a little bit stronger, and I think that's because in this book, Kellen is kind of on his own, and he's kind of got to figure out who he is based on politics in a particular situation rather than bouncing off the characters that formed his crew before. And I'm trying to be very vague so that I don't give away who is where and what's going on with the characters that we know and love. We do follow Kellen in this one as kind of a lone spellslinger, and he accidentally gets noticed by the Queen, which is why he is called Queenslayer. He gets put up to it by accident. He has a card game with her, and it kind of all unfolds from there. The tagline to this one is "Freedom is a fantasy," and I feel like that really encapsulates what Kellen learns and grows from in this series, particularly in this book. He learns something new in every book about himself and about the world, and I feel like this book was more about him getting situated with the world and figuring out what that means, rather than him necessarily figuring out something deep and personal about himself. He does fight against himself quite a lot in this book, and you do see his thoughts go back and forth in regards to his identity, which I really liked, but I don't know why it wasn't quite as strong as the first 4 books in the series. This one had potential and almost made me cry. I was like on the cusp of crying, but it didn't make me bawl, and Soulbinder made me bawl twice. So that was a hard ask to get this one to make me cry more than once. But like I said, I did give this one a 5 out of 5 stars. I'm looking forward to Crownbreaker, which is, I found out, the last book in the series, so I'm going to be really sad to say goodbye to this series at the end of this year. It has quickly become one of my new favourite series just because of the fact that we've seen Kellen grow so much and we've had such an insight into his character, and I really believe everything he does. He's written in such a compelling but also funny way, and I did laugh in this book as well. I kind of predicted this book a little bit more than the others as well, so that might have lended to my lesser 5-star rating as opposed to this was amazing and blew me out of the water 5-star rating. But rest assured, I did love this one still. Now next up, I read an audiobook called Daisy Jones and the Six, and I read that for the reading rush just by accident, so I'll link my vlog below and in the cards if you're interested in watching that. Daisy Jones and the Six is by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and it's a young adult story. It's fictional, so it's not real. It's based on a band called The Six and then a singer called Daisy Jones, and it follows them as they kind of pave their way to fame, and it really delves into talk about drugs and drug use in the music industry and record labels and how they formed their band and how everything was kind of a mess. So if you don't want to really read about drugs or drug use, then maybe give this one a little bit of a miss, but I really liked it for the fact that Taylor Jenkins Reid really knows how to tell a compelling story. I really like The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and this was kind of like a young adult version of that. I like the tone of it, and I loved that the audiobook had so many different narrators because it was told again like Evelyn Hugo in an interview format and looking back at the past, and it had the bandmates from now telling us about what happened in the 70s and 80s. I found that method of storytelling really compelling because the way that their narrators interact in the audiobook really paint a clear picture of what's happening in the actual story, and I like that about Sadie by Courtney Summers as well. I like audiobooks with multiple narrators, obviously. I gave Daisy Jones a 4 out of 5 stars. I really liked it. It's not going to be a new favourite or anything, but I gave Evelyn Hugo about a 4.5, so I feel like Taylor Jenkins Reid is definitely up there with contemporary authors that I really enjoy reading from, and that's not something that I usually dive into very often, is a contemporary book, so I'm really happy that I really enjoyed Daisy Jones and the Six, and it's nice to just sprinkle a few contemporary books in between all of my fantasy and sci-fi reading, it kind of clears my reading palette and gives me a little bit of a taste of something different so that it freshens me up for the next fantasy book that I jump into. It turns out I gave a lot of 4 out of 5 star ratings for these books because I read Poison Study next, and I also read this one for a reading rush, and this was also on my priority list to read this year, so I'm really chuffed that I finished this one. It is, again, a 4 out of 5 stars. It is about a character named Yelena, and she gets the choice of becoming the food taster for the king, and it's either that or she gets put to death because she's being tried for the crime of murdering somebody, and you find out why and what's happened as the story progresses, but I'm not obviously going to say why. Being a young adult fantasy, this also had little tidbits of information about the magic system as well, which wasn't hugely delved into in the first book. This was more kind of fleshing out who Yelena was, what she believed in, what a fighter she was, and how she's been tasked with her survival at the palace under the king and under the people who wanted to murder her. There were a few things in this book that I was like, that's going to happen and this is going to happen and that's the way the plot's going to go, and I was right, but I didn't care that I was right. I enjoyed it regardless. I feel like 17 or 18-year-old Beck, or even 16-year-old Beck, if she'd picked this up back then, this would have become my new and biggest obsession. I have loved Throne of Glass, which was kind of a similar premise to what this was, so I feel like if I read both of them around the same time, I would have been 100% obsessed with both series. But as it is, I'm picking it up now. I really did enjoy it. It was a 4 out of 5, like I said, and I think I have a couple of books in this series and then potentially in another series by her, so I need to go and figure out what I've got to see if I can actually continue reading these or not. Next up, I read some comics. So the first one is Paper Girls by Brian K. Vaughan, and this is the second volume, and I read the first volume a little while ago, and I have a review for that actually on my channel. This is a series that follow a bunch of paper delivery girls in the 1980s, and they end up stumbling onto kind of a time machine situation, and then the second volume picks up just after that situation happens. So I don't want to say too much about where they are and what's going on and who they're interacting with, because obviously it's going to spoil the last page of the first volume, and that is what really hooked me of getting into this series. But as for this volume, I almost gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I gave it about a 4.75, which seems like a bit of a cop-out rating, but there were a couple of panels that I was like, that's a little bit chaotic and confusing. I don't really know what's going on. But then 90% of the other panels I was really invested in, and I wanted to know exactly what was going on and what all of these kind of tidbits of plot that we keep getting fed mean. And for that reason, I am kind of low-key obsessed with this, and I really want to continue reading. There was a full page in this that made my jaw drop, and I love the way that Brian K. Vaughan can kind of just plant bombshells into his story and plot. I think that's incredible about him, and it's why Saga's one of my favourite series, so I'm really loving Paper Girls. I can't wait to continue the third volume when I eventually haul it on this channel. And if you haven't read Paper Girls, then I would recommend it, but just know that it's definitely going to be a sci-fi going into it. It's not a contemporary in any sense, even though the premise is about paper girls delivering newspapers in the 1980s. And then I read 2 more comics, but the ratings for those kind of declined from 4 stars. So I read Descender Volume 1 by Jeff Lemire, and this was a beautifully illustrated comic book, but unfortunately I hyped up the art to myself hoping that the story would match, and the story, while it is compelling and intriguing, it didn't quite match up to what I thought it would be, but it does have potential. This is about a boy named Tim21, and he wakes up on a planet by himself, and he is a cyborg, so he's not a human being at all. He doesn't know what has happened, but in the time that he has been asleep, his family have been murdered, and he was a robot tasked with being a companion for a small boy, so they were just playmates, and he wakes up to find everyone is dead. And on Earth itself, there is a big cataclysmic event where robots and humans are at war with each other, basically. Their species are at odds. I'll just show you really quickly some art because this is a beautiful story, and I keep talking about the art but then not showing you, so I feel like I've done you a bit of a disservice. But I gave this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it, and the art is probably what's going to make me continue. This wasn't too much of a cliffhanger ending, but it was just enough breadcrumbs to get me interested in potentially continuing it, so it's not going to be a high priority for me or anything, but I did enjoy it, and I read this for the reading rush as well. And then in addition to Descender and Paper Girls, the next comic that I read was Steel Prince Volume 1, and this is the Shades of Magic series. It is the prequel comic series to her Darker Shade of Magic book series by V.E. Schwab. So the Darker Shade of Magic series follows Kel and Lila Bard and a bunch of other characters in the Shades of Magic world, but the king in that series is actually the prince in this series, so this is very much a prequel. It follows the Steel Prince and what he does before he becomes king of Red London. If you haven't heard of these series, they are definitely fantasy. They are set in one of the few Londons, so there are parallel Londons in this world. There's red, black, white, and grey. And so magic, especially elemental magic, is very prevalent in this series. It's kind of if you got X-Men and you got a fantasy book and you mushed them both together, that's what you would get in this series. So because I'm a huge X-Men fan and because I'm a huge superpowers and fantasy fan, I thought I would absolutely adore this series, and I have read her Darker Shade of Magic books and really loved them, but I didn't love this as much. It kind of left certain things to my imagination and played coy with me when it came to dialogue, and I wanted things to be more set in concrete, and it was also a fairly, I don't want to say basic, but it was a fairly basic story, and I feel like there's going to be a lot built on after this, but it wasn't enough really to hook me straight away into the first volume. I am interested in King Maxim, but I'm not completely compelled to read about him like I was with Kel and Lila Bard, so I'm probably going to put this series on hold. The reason I bought this volume is because I met V at Supernova, which is like a Comic-Con convention in Australia. She was very generous and came to Melbourne and she signed this for me, so I thought I had to read this year because this is when I got it. But now that I've read it, I don't know if I'll dive headfirst into the rest of this series. I think I'll just wait until she releases her Touch of Power series, which is the books that she's writing and not the comic books, based on the Darker Shade of Magic world. So they're the sequel to A Darker Shade of Magic, that trilogy. Unfortunately, this was about a 3 to 3.5 stars for me. I just found that the plot fell a little bit flat. I was interested in Maxim and his interaction with a particular character, but further than that, I didn't really care for what was happening. So maybe it gets built on in the later volumes. If you've read them, definitely shout at me in the comments and get me to read them, because I do like V.E. Schwab as an author, but I feel like sometimes, and in some cases, her stories get a little bit overhyped, and I tend to go in with raised expectations and then I suffer for it, and my reading experience kind of suffers for it too. So this is the second last book that I'm going to be talking about in this wrap up, and it is Cersei by Madeline Miller. And again, this was another priority book, so I'm getting my priority reads off my TBR, which I'm really proud of. This is an adult fantasy book. It is a Greek retelling of Cersei the Witch in Greek mythology, and I really love mythology. I really love reading about it. I love reading retellings and adaptations of it. I'm an avid fan of Rick Riordan, for example, and I thought because this was an adult retelling that it would have a little bit more grit compared to the Percy Jackson series, and it definitely did. That being said though, it was fairly easy for me because I listened to this on audiobook to tune in and out with what Cersei was saying, and I found that the writing in this was very beautiful and very lyrical and very descriptive, and because of that it kind of lulled me into a relaxed state, and so it was easy for me to tune in and out, whereas if I was reading it, I probably either would have put it down and picked it up at random, or I would have not been as compelled to read it. I want to say that I would be invested in reading it, but sometimes when words get a little bit too lyrical, I tend to skim read, unfortunately. I gave this one, again, like many of my other books that I've read in the past couple of months, a 4 out of 5 stars. I didn't like the sexual assault in this book to be part of the plot, but I don't actually know the original myth of Cersei, so I imagine Madeline Miller is just retelling the myth as she has read it. So that's not really a fault on Madeline Miller, it's more a fault on my reading taste. I don't really like explicit sexual violence in my books, and it was remedied on the page, but if rape or sexual violence is something that upsets you, then it does happen in this book, and I can't say what page, so I can't tell you a specific warning, but just in case, it is a little bit gritty, and thankfully the characters that do it suffer on the page for what they did. I really liked the ending of this though. I liked how Cersei developed particular relationships and who with. I'm not going to say how they ended up, but I like the inclusion of monsters and the inclusion of magic, and I liked how we got to see into her witchy side and we got to see her figuring it out. I really like that detail of the book, and I'm glad I read it for that reason, but I don't know if I'd reread it anytime soon. I don't actually know where I heard it, but I was told to read this and then The Song of Achilles, which is her other standalone Greek myth retelling, because apparently this one is good, but it's not as good as The Song of Achilles. So I've got The Song of Achilles on my TBR and I'm looking forward to reading that. My camera really isn't liking me, the focus keeps going in and out, so if that happens while I'm filming and talking about Cersei at the end and then the next book that I'm going to talk about, I do apologise, but I've got to get through this wrap up. It's getting dark outside, so I've really got to hurry it up. Wrapping up Cersei, I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I liked it, it was a great retelling, but I don't know if I'd necessarily reread it. It was a decent book, I enjoyed it, and it's now not on my TBR anymore, which is I guess a positive. And then the last book that is on this wrap-up video is Deviate by Jay Kristoff, and Jay is one of my favourite authors, but unfortunately my expectations were a little bit high when it came to this book. I did read Lifelike, which is the first book in this series, and it's a young adult sci-fi. If you didn't know, the first book follows a character named Eve, and she encounters this lifelike named Ezekiel, and then they kind of go on, for lack of a better word, a quest with her best friend Lemon Fresh, and then Deviate follows directly after the fallout of the first book, and I don't want to go too much into detail of what happens. I kind of predicted what would happen in Lifelike, like, but then the last line of the entire book is what made me want to read Deviate, and Deviate actually follows Lemon Fresh, who is the side character in the first book. And for the most part, I really did like this book. The slang and the swear words that were not swear words because they were adapted to not be swear words kind of took me out of the book a little bit, and the language that Lemon uses sometimes is a little bit excessive, but if I was younger, I think I would really like it and be compelled to read more, because she kind of discusses things in character and I'm very convinced of who she is. So I can only critique it to a certain point, and that point is that I don't necessarily like it, but I'm sure it's something that everyone else will probably enjoy. As for the plot of this one, as certain things cropped up along the way, I kind of filed them away for future reference, and I thought, oh, this is going to happen and that might happen, and for the most part I was right in the way I guessed certain things, or my suspicions about certain things were right as well. So I did predict a little bit of what was going to happen in this, and I didn't predict what would happen at the end. I'm glad the way that this ended the way it did. It didn't necessarily end with a lot of hope like the first book, and that's why I want to continue and read the third one, because Jay is really good at doing cliffhangers but developing characters to a point that you really care about what potentially will happen after that cliffhanger, and that's what keeps me invested in reading and getting the next book in the series. So for what it's worth, I really liked this series. It wasn't something that was going to be my favourite overall, but I'm on board with it at least. I do wish it was a little bit grittier, but it's obviously written for a younger audience than say Nevernight is, so I can't really complain too much. I don't know if I've actually said my rating yet, but I gave this a 3.5 stars out of 5. It's getting dark, so I better wrap up this video. These are all of the books that I've read recently. I have a decent mix of adult and young adult and comics, so I'm pretty happy with that mix. I didn't branch too much out of genres. I stuck to fantasy and sci-fi for the most part, but let me know in the comments if you've read any of these or if any of these are on your TBR. I'm gonna go put these down because these are heavy, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.